All right, today we're tackling a big one. You've almost certainly heard of it, Robert Kiyosaki's Rich Dad, Poor Dad. It's one of the best-selling personal finance books ever for a reason. We're going to break down the key ideas, the big aha moments that really separate how the wealthy think about money from how, well, most of us are taught to. So let's get into it.
So the whole book really revolves around this central story from Kiyosaki's childhood. See, he had these two father figures, two major influences, pulling him in completely opposite directions. On one hand, you had his own dad, super smart, highly educated, but always struggling with money. That's his poor dad. And on the other hand, you had his best friend's dad, an entrepreneur who was building wealth. That's his rich dad.
And this quote, man, it just perfectly captures the huge gap between their worldviews. One dad saw money as the source of problems, while the other saw the lack of money as the real issue. And that's the key, right? It wasn't about the balance in their bank accounts. It was all about their mindset. This fundamental clash is what set Kiyosaki on his journey to figure out how wealth really works. You can see it in the advice they gave him. Poor dad's go-to advice was the path most of us are told to follow, right? Study hard, get good grades, land a safe job with a good company, and just kind of count on your pension and benefits. But Rich Dad, totally different playbook. He was all about learning how money actually works, about building things that make you money and not being afraid to take smart, calculated risks. And this gets to a really critical point the book makes. Think about it. Where do we learn about money? It's not really in school, is it? We learn about it from our parents, around the dinner table. And that means that our entire financial programming, our whole mindset about earning, spending, and saving, is pretty much locked in before we even get our first real job. Okay, so how did Rich Dad start teaching these lessons in the real world? Well, it all began with this one story, which is probably the most important one in the whole book. So picture this. Robert and his friend Mike are just 9 years old, and Rich Dad makes them a pretty unusual offer. He says, "Come work for me. I'll teach you everything you need to know about money." The job? Dusting cans in one of his stores for 3 hours every Saturday. And the pay? A whopping 10 cents an hour. Yeah, you heard that right. So after a few weeks of this, doing boring work for basically nothing, Robert is fed up. I mean, he feels like he's just being used as cheap labor, a total slave. He hasn't learned a single thing about getting rich, and he is ready to walk. And it's this frustration that leads to this huge, game-changing conversation with Rich Dad. And this is where Rich Dad drops the first big truth bomb. He tells Robert, you're already feeling what most adults feel their entire lives. You're in the rat race. He breaks it down like this. Most people's financial lives are driven by two simple emotions, fear and desire. Fear of not having enough money gets you out of bed to go to work, and then desire for all the nice things you can buy keeps you chasing that next paycheck, that next raise. It's exactly like this donkey chasing a carrot it can never quite reach. So what's the lesson? Rich Dad throws them a real curveball. He says, I want you to keep working, but I'm not going to pay you anything at all. It sounds crazy, right? But the point was to get them off that hamster wheel of working for a tiny paycheck. He wanted to force their brains to start looking around, to spot opportunities to create money that were invisible to everyone else. And you know what? It actually worked. With their minds now open, they noticed something. The comic book guy would leave behind the old unsold comics. So they asked if they could have them. He said sure. They took all these free comics, cleared out a spare room in Mike's basement, and opened a comic book library. They even hired Mike's little sister to be the librarian and charged all the neighborhood kids 10 cents admission to come and read for hours. And this is the breakthrough, the big aha moment. Their little comic book library was making money whether they were physically there or not. For the very first time, they weren't just working for money, they had created something that was working for them. This was their very first asset. That whole comic book story perfectly sets up what is, without a doubt, the single most important lesson in the entire book. If you take one thing away from this, it should be this: understanding the difference between an asset and a liability. And Rich Dad's definition is refreshingly simple. Forget all the complicated jargon. An asset is just something that puts money in your pocket. That's it. And you guessed it, a liability is the complete opposite. It's anything that takes money out of your pocket. The whole game, according to the book, is that the rich spend their lives buying assets. The poor and middle class, well, they spend their money on liabilities that they think are assets. You can really see this when you map out how money moves. For someone who is poor, the pattern is simple. Money comes in from a job, and it goes right back out to pay for necessities, taxes, food, rent, transportation. There's nothing left at the end of the month. Okay,
Now let's look at the middle class. The income is higher, for sure, but what happens to it? It goes to buy liabilities. The bigger house with the big mortgage, the new car with the monthly payment, the credit card debt, and all those things create more expenses. This is the very definition of the rat race. You earn more, so you spend more, which means you have to keep working harder and harder just to stay afloat.
But the rich, they play a different game entirely. When they get money, their first priority is to buy assets. Things like stocks, bonds, businesses they don't have to manage, real estate that generates rent. And what do those assets do? They generate more income. That new income is then used to buy even more assets, creating this incredible, powerful, upward spiral of wealth. So the big question is, how do you actually start making that shift in your own life? Well, Kiyosaki gives us a really useful tool for this, a way to understand where your money is coming from. It's called the cash flow quadrant. It's a simple diagram that basically breaks down the 4 ways people earn income in our economy. All right, let's break it down. On the left side, you've got E for employee. Pretty straightforward. You have a job. Under that is S, which stands for self-employed or small business owner. This is where you own your job, like a doctor or a freelance artist. Now, over on the right side, you've got B for business owner. This is someone who owns a system and has people working for them. And finally, I for investor, where your money is what works for you. And here's the most important distinction. The left side, the E's and the S's, that's where you work for money. Your income depends on you actively working. The right side, the B's and the I's, that's where your money works for you. And according to Kiyosaki, the path to true financial freedom is all about moving yourself from the left side of this quadrant over to the right. So when you boil it all down, what's the big takeaway? The book's message is really empowering. It argues that your financial destiny has very little to do with how much you earn and everything to do with the choices you make with your money and, most importantly, with your mind. So where do you go from here? The book lays out a couple of key steps. First is the idea to mind your own business, which doesn't mean starting a company. It means focusing on building up your own personal asset column. And second, and this is huge, you have to constantly work on your financial intelligence, your financial IQ. The more you learn, the better you'll get at finding and creating those income-producing assets. And really, the book leaves us all with one final, very powerful question. Every single dollar that comes into your hands is a choice. It's a vote for the future you want, to be rich, poor, or middle class. So, as you go about your day, the question you have to ask yourself is, what are you choosing?